everyone. My name is Kristen Hanson. I'm a community relations advocate with the Patients' Rights Action Fund, a leading national, nonpartisan, single-issue organization that protects the rights of patients, people with disabilities, elders, and people who are poor from deadly harm and discrimination inherent in assisted suicide laws. I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you about the dangers of assisted suicide. I'd like to start out by sharing two videos that explain how I became involved in this issue.
My family has had a motto someone would complain about. I can't go out to school today because I'm sick. And my dad's response would be, you can't hurt steel. I was very active growing up, did a lot of sports, played football. My family has a long line of military service, specifically the Marine Corps. While I was in the Marine Corps, I got married to my wife, Chris.
Life couldn't have been more perfect. We had just had James. He was 1 year old. We had moved to Florida. JJ had a job that he absolutely loved.
We were living what people would consider as the American dream. May of 2014, I started to feel what felt like a very deep anxiety attack. And I knew something was wrong with me because it just kept getting worse. And at that point, my ability to speak began to go away.
My phone rang and I saw it was JJ's number on my caller ID. And I answered it, and a woman's voice was on the phone. She was a paramedic. She was with JJ. He had had a grand mal seizure.
They started doing tests. They weren't going to do an MRI initially. However, my wife, Chris, pushed them very heavily to do an MRI.
The neurologist came back in and looked at us, and I'll never forget the look on his face when he told us, you have 2 lesions in your left temporal lobe.
Grade 4 glioblastoma multiforme, which is one of the, if not the deadliest form of brain cancer that exists. The neurosurgeon who conducted the biopsy said that the cancer was inoperable. You have 4 months to live. In a best case scenario, you may get a year.
And that was it. He walked away.
When a week before that, you were running, you were having fun, you were hanging out with your kid and your wife, you were working, and everything seemed fine. And all of a sudden, a man comes in and says, you're going to die. You don't just accept it because someone said it. We had one doctor that told us that, go home, enjoy the time you have left. And yet another doctor said, we got this, no problem, we'll get it out.
He had the surgery at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and he had an amazing neurosurgeon. They monitored to see if he was having seizures that we just couldn't see. Over the next 24 hours, he had 9 more seizures. So by the time that was done, he couldn't talk at all.
Would this be easier if I just gave up? If I just said, this is too much of a burden on my family, the pain is difficult, I don't want to deal with this. What if I just said I had enough and ended it? I would be okay the next day because I would be gone. I wouldn't feel the pain. I wouldn't feel the emotion. They do. My wife would feel it for the rest of her life. My son would not have one more day to spend with me.
No matter how bad those days were, we had to fight for James. James makes us stronger.
I still have cancer today. I still have active cancer cells. I'm still on chemo. And I have people say all the time, you don't look like it. You don't look like you have active cancer. It's because every single part of my day, I spend towards improving my ability to live. I followed the Brittany Maynard case. To a certain extent, I could identify with what she was dealing with. Same disease, roughly the same age, both had families, but I don't agree with what she chose to do. You can't unmake that choice. Once you do it, it's done. Unless a cure is found, the disease will come back. When and how, I don't know. My hope and my fight is to keep it at bay for as long as possible.
I'd say my biggest fear with assisted suicide is that a patient will go to a doctor who already views them as a terminal patient and sees little hope for anything else, any other treatment options, any other outcomes other than death.
Chris has saved my life. And she did that while being a mother, while paying the bills. I didn't have to ask for it. I didn't have to need it. She did it because she loved me. And she's my best friend. And I couldn't imagine being with anybody else besides her.
You are more my hero now than I ever thought possible. And I love you, and you're my best friend.
Every single day is a gift. And you can't let that go.
He looks at the world and he wants to make it a better place. He said, Chris, we got to share this to help other people. They need to know that it's okay for this to happen, and don't be afraid. I started tearing up, and I said, only you, James Joseph Hanson, are worried about other people in this moment. He only has about 4 weeks left to live.
Yeah.
And that was a week ago. The end of September, he got depressed, and there was no hope at this point.
I was done. Done. Now, we're going to keep going.
It's been hard to advocate for JJ. I'm his healthcare proxy. He chose me because I think he knew that I would think, what would JJ want? And I would ultimately fight for him, but I would also let him go. All we can do is today, right?
Yeah.
And we can make today the best we possibly can. We had 3.5 years now when they first only gave you 4 months.
We are in love with each other. No worries.
Always and forever. Try to hold on to hope for yourself, for those around you, for people you don't even know. And it could be changing their life and you don't even know. You can't think about assisted suicide in one situation. You have to step back and think about who it could hurt, because it puts so many people at risk. And that is the danger with assisted suicide. You'll never know. If you make that choice, if you do that, you might have lived like JJ. He had 3.5 good years, so many beautiful moments we've shared as a family. James has gotten to know his daddy. He knows who his daddy is now. We have Lucas. The joys that we have been able to experience in these 3.5 years are too many to count. And when I stop for a moment to think of, if we had listened, if we had given up hope, we would have missed out on so much. Lucas requires so much care and love right now. He's dependent on me for everything. And I do it with joy. I take care of him with joy. And why is that so different at the end of life? Every moment we can share together is a gift.
On the surface, our family's story is undeniably tragic, but our journey is also one of hope that's been filled with so many miracles, big and small. It's allowed us to smile amidst the sorrow and the suffering. When I look back, I'm filled with overwhelming gratitude for all that happened in the 3.5 years we had with JJ after his diagnosis. There are so many moments where it's clear that if something had gone differently, we may not have had that time together, and that would have been even more tragic. May 13th, 2014 was a day that started out like any other and changed our lives in an instant. When I arrived at the ER, the nurse told me they would be discharging JJ soon. All the standard tests they'd run looked normal. I wanted desperately to believe what she said, but something inside me kept saying that there was more. So I asked, wasn't it possible that the CAT scan had missed something? She curtly replied that our insurance had a very high deductible and an MRI wasn't necessary since the CAT scan was clear. I told her we didn't care how much it cost, and I insisted that we weren't leaving until they did an MRI. They ended up doing one that evening, and the next morning, the neurologist came in to see JJ. He tested JJ's reflexes and asked him some questions. And after about 5 minutes, he said, well, 50% of people have a seizure and never have one again. So I'm going to send JJ home without any seizure medication. And let's just hope he doesn't have another one. I was nervous to question the doctor, but I knew that I had to ask about the MRI results since he hadn't mentioned them. I was shocked when he said he hadn't realized that they'd done one and he needed to go look at the results. When he returned, his expression had changed dramatically, no longer reassuring and optimistic, but grim with concern. He shared the news that JJ had 2 lesions on his left temporal lobe of his brain. What would have happened if I hadn't persisted? If I hadn't trusted my intuition and listened to that little voice guiding me? What if I had let them send JJ home? I knew in that moment that I had to fight for JJ. I had to learn as much as I could about his condition and become his fearless advocate. If JJ's cancer had gone undetected and they sent him home, it would have grown. The biopsy revealed that it was cancer, and the neurosurgeon said that the tumors were already inoperable because they were located on JJ's speech center. If they operated, the chance was too great that he would lose all ability to speak and understand language. JJ had the most aggressive form of brain cancer, glioblastoma multiforme, also known as GBM, and it can double in size every 2 weeks. I was told JJ likely only had 4 months to live. Maybe if we were lucky, we could get a year. If it had been a less aggressive tumor, maybe we could have gotten 3 years. But JJ's cancer was the most aggressive kind there is. In that moment, time stood still. I couldn't breathe. Everything went silent except for the pounding of my heart and the sound of my own voice in my head crying out, why? Why only 4 months? Why not 3 years? We have a baby, our poor baby, poor James. In that moment, 3 years felt like an eternity, and I would have given anything to have that time together. Although everything the doctors were telling us sent a message of hopelessness, I knew that we had to hold on to hope. We had to fight for James so he could have as much time with JJ as possible. But the one thing we didn't have was time. And every major brain cancer center we called said it would be at least 2 weeks to get a consultation. We reached out to family and friends to share the terrifying news of JJ's diagnosis. And as fate would have it, one friend we called happened to be out with another group of friends in South Tampa, and he shared JJ's story with them. One of the men there just happened to be the chief of anesthesiology at the Moffitt Cancer Center, the best cancer research center in the Southeast, right in Tampa, where we were living at the time. It was the same place we had been told it would be at least 2 weeks to get an appointment. But this doctor was next door neighbors with the chief of neurosurgery at the Moffitt Center. He said he would ask if JJ could get in sooner. Sure enough, by that evening, we got a call saying that we had an appointment the next day with the chief of neurosurgery. I can't begin to explain how much hope it gave us. When we went, he told us that they could operate, but that they would have to do awake surgery, where they'd ask JJ questions as they went along with the surgery to see how much of the surgery was damaging his cognitive functioning and how much they could safely remove. But awake surgery is very dangerous, and we were told that the recovery would be difficult. So we wanted to get another opinion from Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City, where we would be closer to JJ's family. JJ had worked for several years in New York State politics after he left the Marine Corps, so he called everyone he knew that might be able to get him into Sloan. He called legislators, the governor's office, congressmen, but they all came back with the same answer. We're sorry, but it's going to take at least 2 weeks until they can see you. The neurosurgeon at Moffitt was clear. He said, there is no more time. You needed this surgery weeks ago. So we scheduled the surgery at Moffitt for the following week, and we flew to New York in the hopes that we would miraculously get an appointment. If we had no luck, we would fly back over the weekend to Tampa. As we were waiting in the Tampa airport to board the plane, we received a phone call from a family friend. JJ's dad had called him to share the news, to which Vinny, his longtime fishing buddy and very Italian friend, replied, I got a guy. I'll call Doc. We didn't know it at the time, but Doc, who has a second home in our small town in upstate New York, just so happened to be the chief of immunotherapy at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Vinny is a carpenter and had done work for Doc. To our amazement, Vinny was calling to tell us that the doctor had gotten JJ in with the chief of neurosurgery at Sloan. We had to be there by 8 a.m. the next morning. Back-to-back appointments with the chiefs of neurosurgery at 2 of the leading brain cancer research hospitals in the U.S. It was such a miracle. The neurosurgeon's response to JJ's scans was, we've got this. We do 3 of these a day. It's our bread and butter. And they could do the surgery with JJ asleep. They felt they had a safe route of entry, and it would be much safer than Moffitt's awake surgery. So we scheduled the appointment for their next available surgery, May 29th, which just so happened to be our 9-year wedding anniversary. The neurosurgeon removed the 2 tumors and actually found a 3rd smaller tumor. And JJ seemed to be recovering well initially, but on the 2nd day, his speech and comprehension started to decline. By the 4th day in the hospital, he didn't even understand how to answer when they asked him what his name was. My heart broke as I looked in the doctor's eyes, and I could see that their look had changed. They were void of hope. I was told that they'd give him 1 more day in the hospital, but if nothing changed, they'd have to send him home and they'd just see how he did. I knew that they were giving up on him. But I refused to give up hope. There had to be something they were missing. I was convinced. JJ needed me to believe. He needed me to fight for him. So I frantically searched the internet on my phone at JJ's bedside and continued questioning the doctors. I finally convinced them to do an EEG to monitor for seizures. I hoped that he was having subclinical seizures that we just couldn't see, even though they had him on a high dose of prophylactic anti-seizure medications. And it turned out that he was. By that evening, JJ had his first visible seizure, and he ended up having 9 more seizures over the next 24 hours before they could get them to stop. Those were some of the most frightening days of my life. JJ had a difficult recovery, and the reality was that his prognosis was still very grim. JJ had surgery, radiation, and chemo, but even with all that, his doctors told us that his cancer almost always comes back. 70% of patients with GBM die within the first year. Less than 2% ever make it to 5 years. The one thing patients need more than anything else is hope. So we did everything we could to give JJ the best chance at survival. We enrolled him in a clinical trial, and thankfully, JJ went into remission for almost 2 years. A few months after JJ's diagnosis, Brittany Menard's story was starting to make headlines across the country. Some of you may remember Brittany. She was a beautiful young woman around the same age as JJ, suffering from the same exact cancer. But she famously decided to move to Oregon to end her own life through assisted suicide and to advocate for its legalization in her home state of California. I remember when we first saw her on TV, we could see so clearly how her story was being glamorized to perpetuate a message of hopelessness. JJ looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "Chris, if I'd had suicide pills with me in my nightstand a few weeks ago, I might have taken them, and you can't undo that. This is so dangerous for patients like me." So JJ, not being one to sit on the sidelines, started reaching out to friends to see how he could become involved to help spread a message of hope to other patients. Eventually, JJ connected with the Patients' Rights Action Fund, and a few weeks later, PRAF came to capture our story on that first video I shared with you. A few months after that, when JJ was in remission and off all treatments, he was asked to take over as president of PRAF, leading the national fight against the legalization of assisted suicide. The next year was one of the happiest of our lives. JJ was healthier than we could have imagined. He loved his new job, and we could clearly see the purpose in his diagnosis. JJ's motto became "Every day is a gift," and it truly was. JJ's story had a dramatic impact on slowing down assisted suicide legislation that was threatening to sweep the country after Brittany's story made headlines. It was during that time that we allowed ourselves to dream of the possibility of having more children. But in late October 2016, after a year of trying to conceive, we found out that JJ's cancer was back. The following few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, tests, and more research to see if there were any other promising treatments we could try. We finally settled on a new experimental immunotherapy treatment, but we had to sign paperwork saying that we wouldn't get pregnant. It was too risky. They didn't know if it would cause birth defects. My heart broke as we signed those documents, but we knew that we had to do it. In early November, right after JJ started the treatment, we found out that we were pregnant. Miraculously, we had gotten pregnant right before JJ started the trial. In July of 2017, we welcomed our little miracle baby into the world. Shortly after Lucas was born, JJ's health started to decline, and we found out that the treatments were no longer working. So we did everything we could to enjoy the time that we had together, with the knowledge that every day truly is a gift. In those final years, when he knew his time was limited, JJ chose to fight against the ableism that permeates our society and our medical system, and which has perhaps its most deadly expression in assisted suicide policy. Having a life-limiting disability himself, JJ realized that the disability community's concerns with assisted suicide were warranted. So one of the last things JJ asked of me was to promise that after his death, I would continue sharing our family's story to protect the vulnerable against the threat of legalized assisted suicide. Assisted suicide is dangerous public policy, and there are many fatal flaws, but I know that our time here is limited, so I'm just going to highlight a few. One is that doctors make mistakes. Insurance companies deny care and offer a cheap death instead. Pain is not the reason patients end their lives by assisted suicide. It is a deadly form of discrimination against individuals with disabilities, and mental health conditions often go ignored, and patients struggling with depression receive the medications. It is incredibly difficult to prognosticate 6 months out how much time a person has left. A prognosis of 6 months left to live is an educated guess at best and is often wrong. JJ's story highlights this. He was only given 4 months to live and lived almost 4 years. I've met numerous other GBM patients living 5, 10, 15, 20 years out following their diagnosis. Jeanette Hall is another perfect example. Jeanette Hall was living in Oregon when she was diagnosed with cancer in 2000 and asked her doctor to prescribe her assisted suicide. Fortunately, her doctor had a long-standing relationship with her as her physician and recognized the request for a cry for help. He successfully encouraged her to pursue treatment instead of assisted suicide, and she's still alive today, 20 years later. Jeanette speaks out against assisted suicide, saying that if my doctor had believed in assisted suicide, I wouldn't be here today. When a doctor makes a mistake under normal circumstances and a patient outlives their prognosis by years, it's a happy mistake. But with assisted suicide, it turns deadly. We'll never know how many patients ended their lives prematurely through assisted suicide, yet could have gone on to live months or years longer. When assisted suicide becomes a medical treatment, it injects governmental pressure and profit-driven insurance decisions into everyone's end-of-life care. When faced with the choice, do you think insurance providers will do the right thing or the cheap thing? Proponents of assisted suicide claim that there's never been a documented case of abuse with these laws, but that's simply not true. We know that shortly after Oregon passed its assisted suicide law, 2 patients came forward, Randy Stroop and Barbara Wagner. They were sent letters from the Oregon Health Plan denying them coverage for the life-extending treatment that their doctors were requesting for their cancers, and instead they were offered assisted suicide. Dr. Brian Callister, a Nevada physician, travels the country testifying before state legislators, sharing his personal experience with legalized assisted suicide and insurance companies. I'd like to share a quick video of Dr. Callister's story.
I chose to become a physician because I wanted to make a difference in people's lives. Recently, I had 2 different patients, and both needed life-saving procedures. When requesting a transfer to a center in their home states, one's in California, one's in Oregon, the insurance medical directors I spoke with said they would not cover the life-saving procedure that we'd requested. But hey, by the way, have you considered assisted suicide? Quite frankly, I was stunned. This is something we didn't talk about, we didn't request, we didn't ask for. As much as most insurance companies try to come across as your best friend, they want to do whatever the least costly thing is. It's a lot cheaper to grab a couple drugs and kill you than it is to provide you life-sustaining therapy. Simple as that.
That society, Hemlock Society, morphed and became Compassion and Choices after a very careful rebranding. Derek Humphrey said in his book, Freedom to Die, I quote, "In the final analysis, economics, not the quest for broadened individual liberties or increased autonomy, will drive assisted suicide to the plateau of acceptable practice." Pain is also not the reason why patients choose assisted suicide. Data from Oregon, where assisted suicide first became legal, shows the main end-of-life concerns that people considering assisted suicide report actually relate to existential suffering or disability-related concerns at the end of life, such as fear of being a burden to friends and family. In 2019, nearly 60% of patients ending their lives through assisted suicide cited fear of being a burden as a reason. As you can see, inadequate pain control or concern of physical pain never even makes it into the top 5 reported reasons. Assisted suicide sets up a 2-tiered system where some people get suicide prevention and the standard of care, and others, namely those with life-threatening disabilities, get suicide assistance and healthcare rationing. This insidious form of ableism results in death to the devalued group, and nothing could be more discriminatory. The so-called safeguards that are built into these laws are so weak as to be non-existent. That's why nearly every major national disability rights organization that has taken a position on assisted suicide adamantly opposes it. You can see here on DREAD-F's site the list, some of the organizations listed that oppose assisted suicide. And according to a study published by the National Council on Disability about the dangers of assisted suicide to the disability community, the safeguards in assisted suicide laws are ineffective and often fail to protect patients. Mental health conditions can go ignored. JJ and I first saw this firsthand, that the supposed safeguards against depressed patients committing suicide are inadequate. If this legislation was legal in New York at the time JJ was diagnosed, he could have requested the medication and he would have gotten it, and he could have had it on his nightstand. He would have had those lethal pills with him as he questioned if his life was worth living. None of us knew it at the time, but JJ considered it during his 5th month of treatment when he was going through a physically and emotionally difficult period. He later shared that he asked himself, am I too much of a burden to my family? Is this worth it? Would it be easier for everyone if I just ended my life? Thankfully, JJ didn't end his life, and he went into remission. But if he had had those pills with him in those darkest days, he might have taken them. And you can't undo that. You can't unmake that choice. There's no going back. These laws abandon vulnerable patients like JJ, who can experience periods of depression at any point following their diagnosis, not just when they're requesting the lethal medication, but even at the time they request the medication. Very few patients are ever referred for psychological evaluation. If you take a look here at the data from Oregon, you'll see that in 2019, less than 1% of patients requesting assisted suicide in Oregon were referred out for psychological evaluation. How many of the 188 patients were depressed when they took the lethal pills that year? I can tell you that in an independent study conducted in 2006 in Oregon, and it was later published in the British Medical Journal, they found that 25% of patients requesting assisted suicide were actually clinically depressed, and several of those patients were able to receive the medication anyway. So you see the discrepancy between less than 1% ever being referred out for evaluation and an independent study conducted by researchers finding 25% of patients were clinically depressed. But the truth is, we'll never know how many patients are depressed when they take the lethal pills, because a psychological evaluation is not mandatory. And once you receive the prescription, you're on your own. There's no requirement in this law for a doctor to follow up with you once the prescription is written. As I mentioned, I'm with the Patients' Rights Action Fund, and I wanted to provide you with a link to our website, www.patientsrightsaction.org. On our website, we have many resources available, including the videos that I shared with you today, and other informational handouts and resources for you, and in particular states that you may be fighting assisted suicide, in states where it's not yet legalized and in states where it is legal. Warriors of hope. What makes life here on earth so valuable is that it doesn't last forever. What makes it precious is that it ends. We couldn't save JJ's life, but we can continue to share his story and help to save other lives. We can advocate for better access to truly compassionate, multidisciplinary care at the end of life for everyone, not just a privileged few. We can be warriors of hope in an all too often hopeless world. Thank you.